I think we'll crack on. We obviously had a little bit of inspiration just now on action, and obviously business is very much about action. And I think the conversation that I hope we will have today, looking at the new energy realities, will be very action focused to try and come up with some ideas of what needs to be done and what is being done to help the new energy sector. So we'll come on to the questions and those winners and losers and how we'll make this go forward. But I'd like to first of all introduce our panel, and we're very fortunate to have a great panel. So thanks to our colleagues at the ICC, the International Chambers of Commerce, and ourselves at the World Energy Council for pulling this together. I think it's a really interesting time to be in energy, and some of the people that we have at this table are right at the forefront of trying to navigate what that looks like.
Who is speaking?
So first and foremost, we'll have Marcus Till from Bosch Africa, who is responsible for all of the business in Africa for the Bosch Group, reporting to the management board of Bosch itself, and is involved in a whole range of activities there, even round to agriculture.
So welcome to this side event. My name is Ramon Cruz. I'm the International Policy Manager for the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP.
Gilles Vermont-Deros, I hope I pronounced correctly, is the Senior Vice President for Sustainability at Schneider Electric. And Schneider's a massive company, global leaders in distribution, automation, and energy management. And Gilles kind of oversees that whole definition of that for the company and sustainability for the company. Tanya Morrison from Shell, he's the International Government Relations Manager, and has been working in this space for not that many years, but a number of years, and is very well versed in operations for Shell as well, and can bring that to us. Abid Kamali, who's the Managing Director for Finance of Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Abid, personally, well, not personally, for his organization, looks after $10 billion catalytic finance initiatives, and is involved in the bank's 125 billion projects to 2025. Also works on a number of boards, including Sustainable Avenue for All, where I know a bit from on the financing side. Mike Wilkins, who's Managing Director for Standard & Poor's, the ratings agency who many of you will be aware of, but is also on the FSB task force for climate-related financial disclosures. I think Mike will talk a little bit about that as well. And Dr. Luis Gallardo is the Chief of the Unit of Economics and Climate Change for ECLAC. In Latin America, the UN body for Latin America, and has had a long history in this, also working for other organizations like the World Bank and the IDB, but is leading a lot of the work in Latin America, and in fact, an expert in bringing the chief negotiators for the region together to discuss the way forward for the region. So I'm very lucky to have this panel together. So thank you for your time.
Everybody, or good afternoon.
I'm Stuart Neal. I'm the Senior Director for an organization called the World Energy Council, and we've been in existence for 93 years and trying to track a sustainable path for energy and for our future. So what I wanted to do was to try and set the landscape for you before we have a conversation. And we as an organization have been doing some scenario planning, some looking to the future to 2060. And this isn't the sort of road mapping that often you see, which is saying, how do we reach a 2-degree world, whilst we all want to meet that objective. We want to look at what is happening, how it's happening, and what the possible futures are, so that business and policymakers can see where the tensions are and see where they can address these challenges. So what we have highlighted is that destructive trends are already happening. Something is happening in the world that is changing the energy sector from what we all knew and loved was a transition, a very steady growth model, and there's something happening that's completely changing the energy sector. And we've looked through workshops. We've had an expert group of 70 people, looked at this for 3 years now to identify all of the elements that come into play into looking at the energy sector. We've looked at the historical drivers from that history of doubling population growth, increased GDP, emitting a lot, and the dominance of OECD. We're seeing a slowdown in population growth and aging societies. We're seeing that the GDP will change because of slower labor force growth and less economic groupings within the economy. Planetary boundaries are coming much more into shift. And there is a shift in that power as well. So we've looked at a whole range of things, and I can take you through. These are the inputs to our scenarios, but it's really looking at developing 3 scenarios. Modern Jazz is very much a look at an industrial world, but is very market-driven. Technology is driving our future, which is driving access and driving our future. Unfinished Symphony, it's looking at, we're here, we're looking at a global world, strong policy, unified climate action. And Hard Rock is looking at where we're seeing a certain element of a fragmented society, where countries are looking to work together or work on their own or have bilateral relationships and looking for best fit local solutions. So how does that play out into the real world? So you can see that there is a different shift as you look into it. There will be differences in GDP growth. You'll see Modern Jazz is more orientated towards growth. Unfinished Symphony, there will be a balance of that growth because of you've got competing demands on your time and efforts. And you will have Hard Rock, which is a much more fragmented world and will lead to lower growth and patchwork of states and markets. So what does that show us? Well, we're seeing that the old world of growth is no longer the new world. The traditional growth pattern of increasing each year in terms of primary energy demand is going to peak, probably around 2035. And that will change how people have to look at their business models and how governments have to look at their business models as well. Each of those will have a different way of looking at things. As you see, Hard Rock peaks slightly later and the curve is lower, and Unfinished Symphony will create a much faster change in the way that the world operates. You'll see there's a breakdown there. The demand will, as you see, lower than it has been historically, grey being historic, the future being much lower. Economic growth will be different. It won't be increasing from what we have historically known. But energy intensity reduction is really ramping up. You're starting to see real innovative technologies and the way we use energy really advance. And that's an exciting opportunity, I think, for a lot of businesses and a lot of companies and a lot of policymakers. But it also has inherent risks as well in the way we use energy. And those are some things I think we need to bring forward. The demand for electricity as a service to customers. We're seeing prosumers, we're seeing electricity taking a much greater impact in the world. So from primary energy supply is going to double from where we are today. We're going to continue the phenomenal rise of solar and wind, and what has been touched on earlier about what the great projects here in Morocco. It's only touching the surface at the moment. But then we have to think about the integration issues and how you change from a historic system that is baseload thought to a much more dynamic and thought-provoking way of operating. No longer is it just about grids. It's all about local empowerment, micro grids, and decentralized systems, which require a different way of thinking and require a different whole methodology for the energy sector. For the other sectors, you'll see a different trend, and I'll come on to a little bit more. But there's still growth in the market, in electricity supply, anyway. But what it does mean in terms of demand peaks for resources, coal could be, depending on which route we're going, anything down by 2060 to about 5% of the global market. It could be more. And these are very much decisions that will be taken here and in the real world. We'll see a peaking in oil demand. Again, different versions for different worlds, and that's around 2030 as well. But gas will continue. It won't necessarily be the massive growth that has been conceived, but it will continue as a business as usual model. Transportation is going to be a key issue that needs to be addressed. Currently, we're about 1% EV. We need, on current regulations, to 2030, about 6% if you're just looking at the US, Europe, and China. But we need to reach a much greater level. But that electricity obviously needs to be provided in clean forms rather than more distributed forms. And what does this mean for the climate? Well, we're still not meeting the 2-degree world in any of these scenarios. So more is going to be required from all of us, and that technology shift is happening and will continue to happen, but we still need to push more. And I think that's where governments need to make actions in the next short term, because decisions need to be made now that we'll be making longer term investments. I won't bother taking you through, but in each of the regions there are differences, and you can find those on our website. But what is clear is that the carbon budget is going to get low. Also, how policy is adapted in different parts of the world is very variable. And we rank this in our trilemma work, and you can see that there's very great deal of training, education, and empowerment required across the world. So, in setting the terms of what these new realities are that we need to embrace, we have this peak oil. It's no longer the real worry. It's a worry of a long time ago, actually. But peak demand is something that we need to start thinking about, because it will have significant implications for business and for investment strategies. The carbon budget, we need to start thinking about a decarbonisation rate of about 6% a year to remain on track. Now, that's quite an effort, and the current market signals just aren't enough to allow where we need to get to. The stranded assets to stranded resources issue is something that needs to be talked about in this environment as well, because it will have impacts for countries and will create significant stress for the current global economic and geopolitical equilibrium. We need to think about this shifting system resilience as well. I know others will talk about that. And this operating new landscape requires new tools and new thinking. Innovation. There is great innovation, but how can we create even more? The current market designs often stifle innovation, but what we're seeing in Africa, we'll hear about that in a minute, we're seeing leapfrogging, and that creates tensions as well. So that needs to be thought through. And there needs to be some form of changing global governance. We're starting to see it, but a lot is still being talked about and not being acted upon. And thinking about how tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers on green goods and services can help move things along. And there's some interesting areas that need to be looked at on that, and harmonizing measures. And entrepreneurship. I think we're here in Africa, we still have 1.1 billion people without any access to electricity. There are interesting entrepreneurial things going on across the world. How can we foster more of that? Because adapting to these new realities will require massive effort, and our ability to respond will define both winners and losers. So that's a context for where we are in the world and where we're looking to 2060. So what I'd like now to do is highlight where you can see more of this if you want to, but have a conversation now about what this is. And I'd like, first of all, just to go along the panel and invite our speakers to react and from their context, from their position, of where they see this new reality and where they're operating. Marcus, can I ask you to kick off, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to do so. I represent Bosch in Africa, and for people who don't know the Bosch Group, we're actually involved in 4 large sectors. One is the mobility sector, the second one is the industrial sector, including agriculture, so agriculture and pharma. The third one is consumer goods, and the last one is energy and building sector. And in Africa, we're actually present with all of our 4 business sectors. Our motto has always been secure, sicher, sauber, sparsam in German, secure, clean, and efficient. And we have recently added in the past few years automation, electrification, connectivity. How does that play in Africa? And I would say how also for the discussion here over these 2 weeks is Africa important. I would want to take Africa as one example, as the large continent, maybe the continent in the next few decades, example of emerging markets. And we see it also at Bosch. Mainly the growth from, let's say, a business perspective going forward. And people have heard the story about Africa rising. There's a lot of challenges regarding Africa. I would say either we could say there's a demographic dividend, or we just say there's uncontrolled population growth. We could say there will be industrialization, or we could say it's just a sellout of mineral resources without any actual value add. We could talk about famines versus smart agriculture, or we could talk about chaotic urbanization versus smart cities, chronic traffic jams versus efficient traffic systems versus smart mobility. And just like Stuart has just mentioned, in my personal point of view, and since I arrived in Africa a few years ago, I personally believe that Africa can also even leapfrog other nations and other regions, and that we also need that. And we see the leapfrogging on the banking side with the smartphone. So to speak, the e-banking has been revolutionized from Africa. But as there's so much infrastructure which is just not in place, instead of taking the development routes that a lot of, let's say, the other mature markets have taken, I personally believe that there's a lot of things that can be done, and that we at Bosch Group have also started to do
so I'd like to introduce
make that change. And let me just give you a few examples how to do that. And our Bosch strategy is very much in line with the African Union Strategy Agenda 2063 that I've also read when I first came to Africa, which is looking or targeting, in my own words, to a peaceful region of wealth, which is actually also minimalizing the use of, or let's say, the infringement with local nature. And what we as Bosch are doing, and I think the other ones will also talk much more on, let's say, the energy creation side. We are very much on the usage side, so very much also on the energy efficiency side. And we are working on two things in parallel. On the one hand, to give you the example of mobility sector, where we are very much involved, not only in vehicles in general, which is like automotive. There, we are not talking about Euro 5 or Euro 6. In Africa, very often we're talking about Euro 1. There's hardly any country which is on Euro 1. This has a lot of reasons why that is, and there's a lot of used cars that actually mature market bring into Africa, which has an opportunity in the extended aftermarket. And for us, it is very much also a topic
with many of you.
On the governments, we have a memorandum of understanding here in Morocco, the Moroccan authorities, we have a memorandum of understanding with Nigeria, we have a memorandum of understanding in other parts in Africa.
So just an example of work is with the German
government institutions on making, for example, emission control, engine management, but also the rest of the car, obviously.
A couple of examples here
in terms of really bringing a very old car park actually to lower the emissions. That is one aspect. On the other, and then we are very much involved, not only that people know how much actually the car is emitting, but also we have training centers to make sure that the technicians would improve the engines of the car. That is very much, let's say, the old world.
80% of all
I'll give you another example also from this vehicle that is a little bit from the vehicle sector, mobility sector, mining next to agriculture. I'll just briefly also talk about that in a second. Mining is one of the very, very large verticals in Africa still. In terms of also the industries, we are currently working on start-stop systems, not only for mining trucks, but also for other large engines. If we talk about mining, there's sometimes 75,000 vehicles in the mines. These huge amount of diesel, and I can tell you to electrify these things will be an enormous task, and that might actually not happen maybe in the next decade or two. So what we are involved in is actually having stop systems for these vehicles, so that they actually, if they are not working, if very often people let these engines run, you can actually reduce consumption of diesel by up to 20%. That's, let's say, now some of the experience that we have in Latin America. So this is just one example. We are also around mining 4.0, where particularly in underground mines, we have started to see there's so many drives, there's so many other things underground which are not maintained. So the whole topic about connectivity, mining 4.0, yeah, maybe even Africa could leapfrog other regions while moving from, let's say, manual labor, like in the east of Congo directly, to highly mechanized mining operations,
where we
which will not only improve the lives of the local people, make them much more safe. We'll hopefully no longer talk about blood diamonds, etc., etc., but even make the mining operations much more productive and much less harmful for the environment. The last example that I wanted to say, this is very much once again regarding emerging markets, is agriculture. Agriculture for Africa is huge. And agriculture for Africa, I would even say, is paramount. And I just read we are working, by the way, with the UNIDO, the United Nations organization. I will start to engage with the FAO, who is also very interested in these areas. 25% of global greenhouse gases are estimated to come from the agriculture sector. And if Africa is moving, which has 60% of the still arable usable land, to feed the population of Africa and maybe also part of the rest of the world, there's huge amount of changes. There's deforestation going on, plus a lot of, let's say, the production of agricultural products are using, for example, industrial boilers, commercial boilers, where we are currently educating people to use, for example, gas-fired boilers. The highly efficient gas-fired boilers, that is one aspect, but smart agriculture means much more. And we are working on that in Australia and other parts of the world, where we would put sensors in the soil, which could measure humidity, which could even measure how much water a plant would need, who could actually give advice when to harvest. And if we are really thinking about leapfrogging again Africa, other regions, we can think about smartphones who can give advice to small farmers, to cooperatives, when to harvest, organize their own logistical chain, do much more local value add, where Bosch again comes in not only on the center side, but on packaging, bring this local value add to the local market. So there's lots of things that we can do. I just wanted to highlight these three elements where we as Bosch are involved in
the city and national level, very consistent.
We saw just Schneider Electric are at the forefront of supplying a lot of services to a lot of companies. Give us some examples.
Thanks a lot. I share very well your presentation on the introduction. The challenge is certainly to understand the life without energy. And we know that now is when that is energy is on, that life is on. And you use music to express that and to understand better for myself. I have to share with you an image. From music to food. I think when we are speaking about energy today, it's a question of the war between watermelon and blueberries.
No way that any one of us would have capacity on our own.
In the past, energy winner was watermelon.
Make sure that there are standard methodologies and open data.
In the future, the winner certainly will be blueberries.
And finally, and most importantly, is number 3
in the past,
here, planning and finance.
The vision was, okay, we have to produce a lot of energy in some places.
There are many indicator frameworks that already exist.
Big.
Yet we see that
and
very few
after
cities
that,
are
we have
actually using them. And why is
to
that?
Go,
is in part
to
because
industry,
the indicators themselves may not be measurable. Most developed countries may not be meaningful.
Certainly in the future, with self-consumption, with solar energy, with the ability to have smart system at home, in the building, on the grid, smart cities,
can leverage
we
our
can
capacity
see
to get this done.
That we open a new age about energy and closer to what is gooseberry. If I can continue with this image,
it's a very simple idea,
I think
simple enough that a mayor can speak about it
gooseberry,
publicly.
we don't have a
Everyone
lot
knows
of
what
waste,
this means, and we measured this for
but
28
in
cities around the
watermelon,
world.
we have a lot of waste.
And as you can see,
And
there
we
was
know
great
that
variation between the
to
cities.
consume
Flowing,
100
NDC with only around
with
11,
watermelon,
18%.
we need to have
People
production
actually being able to
between
walk
130 and 150.
The highest we saw was
When we
Paris,
have
where the
blueberries,
city,
we don't have waste.
the only one to reach 100%.
Then it's not possible
But even there, we look beyond
to
the city of
show
only 2
that we
million
will
people
have
to the region of
tomorrow
12 million. we find that that number drops
everywhere.
to only 50%. And
But something is very interesting with this image.
Urban development has
because we have certainly a lot of winners, especially the people without access to electricity. Because when we are in the middle of nowhere, far from the cities, in the middle of Africa, in a remote place, in a village.
And just an example of where we've applied this is Brazil, where we additionally measured who has access.
But to produce village by village,
that like other
with
cities,
new solutions, smart solutions, plug-and-play solutions,
much higher access.
Microgrid,
People there have much higher access.
it's very relevant to have agriculture locally and to keep the people in this place.
For many of us.
It's very relevant to find solution with the just level of money in order to invest. Because it's very hard to invest for 1,000 villages, more than, to find the people to maintain the installation, to organize the financial issues, the business model, and so on. But when we become in the life of the community, certainly it's easier to organize that. I don't know if you know Jeremy Rifkin and the last books of Jeremy Rifkin about the third revolution, industrial revolution. But it's the revolution of the community. And certainly, if about energy, we are able to go
moving to the distant suburbs
from only watermelon to watermelon
civil society
and blueberries. I'm not here to explain that
what should actually happen.
Watermelon is
There was
finished
no way previous to this to really discuss.
I'm not sure that in 50 years I will be with the same speech.
Okay.
We have time for that. But we can see
and so
that we are just
mapping that the city had only
across these two realities.
Very few people.
Certainly, it's and Schneider Electric is the player of that.
But since then, the city,
because my second idea about this topic, it's
set a goal
the companies, the financial sector,
it is very aspirational.
Together and the state don't like something when that is uncertain.
At the national level, the Ministry of Cities
we
has
prefer something that we can see the middle term to have good figures
with rapid transit to increase PNT.
In the past,
also the banks of BNDES
when we speaking about uncertain situations, it was a question of renewable energy,
financing decisions,
disruptive energy.
So just a little overview here of the work that we're doing on mobility.
Hard to understand very well different
so
things.
once again, I think by
And for
continuing
that,
to work at the local level,
when we are speaking about smart solutions for the future, in order to be clear, in order to have a good vision, we prefer some other manner to have electricity.
Thank you so much.
But something is new. First, the price. It's very different today than 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or 5 years ago. Just one thing, to have 1 mega kilowatt with solar.
So here we
in
have
2000, the price was
the Deputy Director of FIA Foundation and the Executive Director of the
Today,
FPI.
the price is between 25 to 35 euro.
And we have
when we are to consider the price of solar panels, between 2010 to now, in 2010 the price, if the price was 100 euro in 2010, the price is now 20 euro or 25 euro. And it's a major change on the reality. It's why the International Agency of Energy published that last year, 80% of the additional kilowatt hours at the worldwide level are from renewable energy. Because the question of uncertainty, it's now very different. In the past, it was renewable energy, but now with smart meter to consume, we are able to adapt offer and demand. We are able to find the way to charge electrical vehicle, computer, to use a lot of different products to consume in industry, at home when we have energy, and to change drastically the manner to understand the grid. In the past, we need to have a lot of energy in order to be sure that when the demand is here, we have the offer. In the future, with smart matter to consume, we have to adapt offer and demand. And it's possible. And it's not only possible in Europe, in our countries, or it's possible everywhere. And it's not expensive. It's why I'm sure that the question of uncertainty is difficult for the French guy. In terms of financial issue, is more now with other manner to have electricity, because it's difficult to have the price about oil, gas. It's difficult to have a vision for 20 years. And certainly, with these two realities, first reality, technical reality, on the price of the technical reality with new renewable energy, especially with solar. And the second thing, the fact that we have a new step about the price, about the primary energy. If we combine these two questions, certainly we have in a new world. For Schneider Electric, it's key, because the goal of Schneider Electric is to provide solutions to mixed energy transition and digitization. Our life, the business of Schneider Electric, is to be able to build digitization and energy transition in order to have smart solutions at home, in the building, in the plant, smart grid, smart quarter, smart cities, and to be able to adapt offer and demand. That is our first goal. The second goal is to provide solutions for access to electricity for the people who have known the force of the planet. It's not possible to continue to live in this planet with a force of the people without access to electricity. It's not only a technical question. It's a global question. You know, we are speaking perhaps more of French vision about the purple economy. The fact that we consider not only the figure for the engineers, but to understand how we can progress, to consider the cultural footprint of the population. And I think it's key to see the future. And it's not, and we have to embark all the people for that. I would like to stop with that. Between watermelon and blueberries, I'm sure this COP22, and you can see everywhere, it's a question of solutions, question how do we act, and with this new solution, and it's not for the future, it's for today. Certainly, we can solve the topic.
Thank you, Gilles. Tanya, I wouldn't like to. It doesn't. Yeah, Shell could be considered as a watermelon, but I know you're looking at certain areas of blueberries. How does that work? Where are you looking at this new reality? Where is Shell looking at this new reality beyond these hallowed tents?
Well, thank you very much. It's very exciting to be here at Business Day at COP22, a year after getting the Paris Agreement come into be agreed, and then obviously more recently come into force. I've been working in Shell for the past 6 years on international climate issues. Before that, I worked in the UK team, and Shell's for over 20 years has been supporting the development of a global climate deal, the first Kyoto, and then this. So it is positive to see that. I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about how Shell sees the energy world evolving. Like WEF, we take a scenario approach. In fact, we've been using energy scenarios for over 40 years now. And earlier this year, we put out a publication, which I have copies of here, A Better Life for a Healthy Planet, which was looking at how we make that transition so that, as said by the previous speaker, everyone has access to energy, but we also meet the demand to significantly reduce the amount of CO2 emissions. This publication is actually a supplement to our earlier scenarios work called Mountains and Oceans. You can find that on the website. It was scenarios looking at different worlds, one where you had more of a top-down approach in the mountains, elites making decisions, and oceans where it was the undercurrents of various different activities moving together. How does that play out both in the political scenario, but what is the impact on energy demand and energy supply, and how can that be taken forward? These scenarios we take considers different ways influences in society could evolve and describe the different routes to a global energy system. The net zero emissions publications takes the most optimistic features of the scenarios and thinks of plausible scenarios or shifts in policy, technology, circumstances, and events that can move us to an even lower pathway and net zero emissions by the end of the century. Along with the goal, as said previously, of providing necessary energy to 10 billion people on the planet. Our analysis suggests that net zero emissions is technically feasible, but challenging. And when we say net zero emissions, we don't mean there'll be no emissions anywhere, but emissions in one part of the world would have to be offset by an offset, a credit somewhere else in the world. Shell sees that transition as both being desirable and possible. I think a lot of people think about what Shell think about our portfolio, the resilience of our portfolio. For many years now, we've been have a project screening value of $40 a ton. We take all of our major projects through and think about what would happen if, once the project's up and running and developed and starting to pay back, if there is a price or a cost of carbon in regulations. It doesn't have to be a direct price as a carbon tax, but anything that would give that effect. And that's taken into account before we make the decisions on whether or not we're going to actually invest in some of our large assets. We've been reducing emissions for many years, making the overall portfolio more energy efficient. We've taken a leadership position in natural gas, which still has a significant role to play in developing the energy future, as both the previous speakers pointed out. It has much lower carbon when used in electricity generation and can be partnered very well with renewables. We've recently established a new business called New Energies. It's going to be looking at biofuels, wind, solar, hydrogen, and exploring how we can participate and play in the electric space. There was a lot of emphasis earlier on electric mobility, but we're still looking at the different approaches that could be taken. Hydrogen is still another option as an energy carrier. It may work better in different parts of the world. And we continue to try to provide a strong voice in the energy and climate debate. As I've already said, we welcome the Paris Agreement. We supported International Emissions Trading Association's work on developing linked carbon pricing systems and have been very active in supporting the development of Article 6. We are part of the World Bank's Paying for Carbon group. I think a lot of you will have seen last week, we were part of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. Has just launched a $1 billion fund, been participating in the World Bank Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. I work a lot on carbon pricing, so all my examples will be carbon pricing. And working to collaborate further with governments and others to develop insights from our scenarios and build views for an energy transition for pathways to the net zero emissions future. As some of you can see, I've got copies of that publication up here. And also, if you want to just download it, a postcard which will tell you where to go. What I do not have with me, but you can find easily on the Shell website, is another publication called Shell Energy Transitions and Portfolio Resilience, and that sets out how Shell is ensuring that its portfolio into the future will be resilient, the types of investment options we're making, including the development of the gas and new energies business. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tanya. I think it's an interesting point there. You're already pricing in a carbon figure for all the investments. So I think that's a perfect segue now into our finance team, as it were, that have been looking at all of this sort of scaling, the ability to bring a lot of this new stuff to market, but also looking at the historic stuff in the system and how do we look at those assets and where carbon price comes into that, I guess, is a bit.
Well, thanks very much, Stuart, and thanks to both ICC and WEC for the invitation. Let me do three things. Let me try and give my reactions to the scenarios, and then I'll give you a little bit of the evidence, if you like, from what we see in the transaction side, and then address the last point you just mentioned, which is, where do we see the investment challenges given the transitions that are definitely underway. So,
thank you very much.
In terms of reactions, I guess, from our perspective, we see a combination of factors that really go to the heart of the trilemma that you presented. And, out of that mix has come some very disruptive innovation. And that's a strong sign. It means market signals are working. I guess that's the jazz scenario, right?
That's right.
And the jazz has made some beautiful music. The beautiful music is that we have now we have renewable energy that's able to be cost competitive on an unsubsidized basis in an increasing geography around the world. And that's evidenced by 50% reduction in the cost of solar PV and onshore wind over the last 5 years. These are rough numbers. So that has created disruption. Secondly, we have on the fossil side, US shale revolution. That's a response to markets as well. And that has, in our view, forever changed the shape of the supply curve for oil. And that has forever changed what we think is going to happen to oil prices going forward and what will happen in terms of behavior of oil companies as they realize, Stuart, to your slide, that there is actually a surplus of resources. It creates new behavior for fossil fuel companies. Then the third interesting disruption is around, again, innovation and technology, and that's, of course, the electric vehicle. And that, again, has a knock-on effect in terms of where we see demand for oil, but also it creates all kinds of interesting other dynamics when you think about autonomous driving, digitalization, the sharing economy. All of these are happening in sync with the availability of electric vehicles, and this has big implications for demand of energy. So those are some of the big forces. In terms of where we see it from a bank, Stuart, you mentioned our $125 billion low carbon commitment. So that's $125 billion over 10 years. We set that out. It's complicated actually. The commitment has been upped over the years. But in simple terms, we have deployed around 41 billion to these kinds of opportunities since 2013. Now, the point there is that it's become easier to mobilize capital for low carbon investments because of these disruptive trends. Our bank's exposure, and this is in the public domain, our bank's exposure has shifted from being, let's say, more coal exposure to renewables to now 9-to-1 in favor of renewables in just a few years. I mean, that's a remarkable indicator of how fast the transition is happening.
3 or 4 weeks back.
Then, in terms of so our client base would be, corporates, institutional investors, and of course, in the US market, retail investors. But for this discussion, corporates, we are seeing exactly what Tanya talked about, large corporates doing a lot of thinking about how they're going to recalibrate business models. And that means shifts in portfolios, it means, acquisitions, it means, new capital raises. There's all kinds of transactions that we see. It means issuances of green bonds to help shift capital more quickly towards new opportunities. And that's where the other client base comes in, the institutional investors. They're crying out for more exposure in clean energy. They also would like to see a shift in some of their investment portfolios. And so the question is, can we come up with product that's suitable to meet the needs of those investors who actually right now have a very small allocation to clean energy for a variety of reasons.
We also have an ambitious program.
So those are the trends that we see. In terms of, so what are the key transitions going on? And more capital will shift to accelerate these trends. More policy, we expect, generally, will become stronger to accelerate these shifts. So it's basically four things. It's decarbonization of the power sector happening at pace, and this is the joy for utilities who are otherwise seeing business models disrupted, increased electrification, providing potential boost for demand for power, because there's, if you like, a shift going on from one part of the energy mix to the power side because of electrification. Secondly, decarbonization beyond power, and Tanya made reference to this in terms of the new energy division within Shell. So all of the big oil and gas majors also have divisions with similar names, and it's to look at emerging technologies that they know, and we all know actually, the 2-degree target, have to be brought to scale and have to be brought commercially viable. So biofuels is a great example. Hydrogen, carbon capture and usage as it affects steel and cement. Those are some examples. The third major trend is the energy productivity revolution. And Gilles and Marcus made reference to this as well. Their companies obviously being at the forefront of this. We know we have to move from about 1.3% energy efficiency improvement year on year to about 3% improvement year on year. There is a huge opportunity set within that area. As a bank, we are looking for creative ways to find, to attract more capital to energy efficiency. It's challenging, but it can be done. Green bonds have been one example. Energy efficiency leasing is a business that's growing, very fast for us. So, those are examples where we see the transition happening as well. And then the fourth one is the fossil fuel, let's call it optimization. Recognizing these big shifts going on, potentially reaching peak oil demand sooner than everyone expected. And of course that creates challenges. So let me just close by saying what I think the three big financial / investment challenges are. Number one, yes, pace of renewable penetration is remarkable. In Germany, in California, in even Maharashtra, in India, 40% renewables on the grid without destabilizing the grid. That's remarkable. We're getting to that point already. But the cost structure of low carbon power means that we need to have different financial solutions to help reduce the cost of capital for the project developers that are promoting renewables. It's just not the same as, to use the analogy, the watermelon energy economy. Blueberries, you finance them in different ways. The second major challenge is 50 to maybe 70%, if you look at all the NDCs, of the investment that's required by 2030 is in the emerging markets. So there's $93 trillion in assets under management amongst the institutional investor community. I think the exposure in emerging markets is very low. What is it going to take to get more capital flowing to emerging markets, given the whole variety of different risks, let's say, although you might argue based on Tuesday's result that OECD countries also have significant policy and political risk, but that's a discussion too. Then the third point, the final point, is fossil fuel is not going away, as you've heard, you've seen in the scenarios, in all of the scenarios. Roughly speaking, fossil fuel economy, even to keep with a 2-degree target, needs $2 trillion a year. $2 trillion a year. Now, as financial institutions, we increasingly get flack for maintaining some exposure in the fossil fuel economy, which I think is a little absurd, given that in all the scenarios, it's clear that we need to continue to make sure that energy access is provided to make, the lights stay on, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is, how are we going to live with that transition, given the need to make sure that we are prudent in how we deploy our fossil fuels, how we use the fossil fuels to keep within the budget, let's say. And the corporates who have the fossil fuels will be, over time, probably suffering changes in their credit quality, their cost of capital, and that has big implications too.
Thank you, Abid. And credit quality or credit, it's not the topic Mike's going to completely focus on, but Standard & Poor's are known for that, and you've been involved in infrastructure investment and understanding, but you're also involved in a little other project you're going to bring forward on disclosures. So please.
Yeah. Thank you, Neil, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Wilkins. I'm Head of Environmental and Climate Risk Research at S&P Global Ratings. I'm going to be talking about the T word, not so much
rail transit, as well as the future, the forthcoming.
Here is transformation in two ways. Firstly, a transformation of the energy sector, which previous speakers, especially Abid's been talking about, and we at S&P Global Ratings are very focused on that transformation. We've done a lot of work on it, and we've published research, for example, on how fossil fuel companies' credit exposure and credit risk will be materially affected by the transition towards the 2-degree pathway. And as far back as 2013, with Carbon Tracker Initiative, we published a scenario-based research how credit in the oil and gas sector would be affected by policies consistent with 2-degree pathway being enacted would actually impact their credit ratings. And that actually showed some level of credit deterioration in the sector, which actually has materialized as there's been a slump in the oil price. So while the cause and effect has been slightly different, the actual impact on credit has been nonetheless as important. But more than the oil and gas sector, we've also seen in the coal sector a massive transformation. And in fact, out of all our coal miner ratings, over half of them are now on the teeth of bankruptcy as CCC. So we've seen that happen in a very short space of time, not just because of climate policy, but because of market influence. And I should stress that a lot of what we're seeing happening in terms of the transformation of the energy sector is not so much related solely to policy, but related to market influences. And that's what we're focusing on more and more in our research. And I should also focus on the impact on the power generation sector, because that effectively has gone through a massive transformation over the past few years. You need to look no further than what's happened in Germany with the policies there, with the Energiewende, with the closure of nuclear power and the massive take-up of renewables, to see how that's impacted the credit quality of the incumbent power generation utilities such as E.ON and the RWE, which have suffered massively in their credit over the past couple of years and their valuations as well. So effectively, transformation of the energy sector is a major topic which is going to impact credit going forward, and we're going to be focusing on it, especially over the coming months, in our research and publications on oil and gas, on power generation, on disruptive technologies, as Abid's referred to, such as energy storage, energy efficiency, and also in the transportation sector, such as electric vehicles. All this has a dynamic knock-on consequence on demand and consumption of energy. But let me move away from the transformation of the energy sector to the next big transformation that we're seeing at S&P Global, and that's the transformation of the financial system. And this leads me to switch hats from being S&P Global to being a member of the FSB Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD for short. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the work of a TCFD, but just briefly, it was set up at the end of last year, in fact, at Paris, by Mark Carney, chairman of the FSB and also governor of the Bank of England. He was mandated by the G20 to set up this task force to look into how climate risk impacted financial stability, and then also to put together an industry-led task force to try and come up with recommendations to how best to make financial disclosures more comparable, consistent, and decision useful for the financial markets, for investors, for insurance underwriters, and for, of course, all the other users of this data in financial markets, such as NGOs. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides which helps illustrate what we're doing. If I move straight on to problems that we've seen, the TCFD, as I said, was set up at the end of last year, convened for the first time in February under the stewardship of Mike Bloomberg and also Mary Shapiro, both of whom you can see in this photograph from one of our plenary sessions in Washington in May. And we focused on the three major problems. Firstly, the lack of a coherent financial reporting framework. Now, that's not to say that there aren't standards already out there. There's something like in the region of 401 different disclosure frameworks out there already for companies and financial institutions to get to grips with. And some of these are extremely good. And it wasn't really the intention of the TCFD to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It was more a question of trying to bring together what is actually the gold from the chaff, bring together what's the best out of these financial disclosure frameworks into something which is much more usable, consistent, and coherent. So that's one element of the solution. The next problem we had to look is the challenge for investors and other financial participants to actually effectively use the disclosures in their financial decisions. So while there's a lot of disclosure, how much of that is actually usable? And that's one thing that led us to make a recommendation, as I'll mention in a second, about scenario analysis. And thirdly, regulators. I mean, regulators are struggling to try and implement financial policies and regulations to help the transition towards a low-carbon economy in a way which doesn't disrupt financial stability. And if you look at what's going on in France at the moment, with Article 173 being brought into law very shortly, you'll see that that is a massive transformation that's going on amongst the investor community in that country because of regulation. But that's just one example. There's a lot more that's probably going to follow, and regulators need to know how to measure and to make comparable decisions based on disclosure. So the solution that the TCFD has been focused on is clear, efficient, and voluntary disclosure framework to address these particular problems. Just to quickly highlight that the TCFD is industry-led. You'll see here the members of the task force, a lot of well-known names from industry, from the financial sector, from associated financial participants, such as credit rating agencies, of course, such as us, but also consultants and accounting firms. So it's very broadly spread, but effectively still industry-led. So just to give you a little bit of a heads up on where we are, in February, March time, we worked on phase 1 of the report, and that came up with a scope of what was going to be included in the final report, and that's what's on the screen in front of you now, where we identified the climate risks and opportunities which are faced by all non-financial, i.e. corporates, and financials such as asset managers, insurers, and banks. And as you see here, the risks were split into physical, non-physical, and also we took into account, importantly, the opportunities of the transition to a low-carbon economy. So we've been looking at trying to highlight as much as where companies can actually benefit from this, as well as where they face risks. So while it's quite straightforward in many respects to describe those risks, actually coming up with a financial impact is less easy. I mean, we've tried to make sure that we can identify for each of those risks where in the financial filing of a company, because we need to stress this needs to be disclosed in public documentation, you can actually see that financial risk actually put down and be in a measurable statement. So that's what you see here. So it's very much a tangible type of disclosure. If we look at where we've gone forward, move on from phase 1 to phase 2, which is where we are now, the task force is actually due to present the phase 2 report with its recommendations to the FSB next week on Thursday, and then hopefully, if the FSB accepts those recommendations, it will be made public as a market consultation on December the 14th. And that kickstarts a 60-day consultation whereby the market will be asked to look at the report, respond, and then hopefully that will be leading to the full launch of the report in February, March next year, and out for adoption in Q2 of 2017. The phase 2 report, and I'll give you a bit of a early sneak preview of the report, will focus on 4 key elements of climate-related financial disclosure, and these are focusing on the governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And it's important to bear in mind that these are not just hard, tangible numbers which are being requested or that are to be disclosed. They are also the more qualitative features around governance, around strategy, and around risk management. So we want companies to consider describing in their financial filings how they're going to address climate risk, how that impacts their strategy, how they expect to manage that risk, and also obviously disclose which are the metrics and targets that they are going to try and meet. The report will be divided into high-level recommendations. There are in fact 11 of them, all broadly in those 4 categories of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. I won't go through them now in the interest of time, but just to say that they are, if you look at them, as I said, focus very much on describing and making sure that there is a narrative around what companies are doing to make sure that there is financial markets and the users of this disclosure understand how climate risk is impacting the company's business models, how they're going to try and adapt to this, as well as what the numbers are going to represent. In terms of the numbers, one of the most striking recommendations is that we are asking companies to do scenario analysis as part of their disclosure, especially with reference to a 2-degree scenario. And there's going to be a supplemental paper being provided when the report comes out on how to undertake this type of scenario analysis, what reference scenarios are currently out there, and how best to try and implement that, so that companies who are coming at this fairly cold can have some form of guidance. We understand that the task force, this is not an easy task. There are many scenarios out there, and the assumptions that go into these scenarios are just as important, if not more so, than the actual scenarios themselves. So we need to understand and have those assumptions disclosed at the same time as the results of that analysis. So just to finish off, the task force is coming to the end of its process. These recommendations will be voluntary. But they will be all-embracing in terms of all financial and non-financial companies will be asked to adopt the recommendations, and the task force will continue to monitor that adoption rate and will be focused on that very much post Q2 2017. But as preparers and users of disclosure, it's worth bearing this in mind. So I'll stop there, Stuart, and hopefully that gives you a good flavor of what's coming up. If you want to know more, there's a side event tomorrow, which is being hosted by Mission 2020 and Aviva over in the Blue Radisson, which gives more detail about what the TCFD is asking from its users in the financial system. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I think, obviously, conscious of time, I do want to get some questions in and also throw some back. But Luis Miguel, you're looking after a fantastically diverse region of the world, and policy, you've heard business is happening, finance is thinking, and some of the businesses are leaping policy. Where do you see the stresses in policy making, and how, and I'll throw this back to my colleagues on the table as well, what is it that we need this meeting here and this meeting here to do? But Luis, let me hand it to you.
Thank you very much. Well, just a couple of points of wrapping up your projections. First of all, I would say that, I'm basically talking about from the point of view, of course, of Latin America. What we have seen recently in Latin America has been an insignificant economic growth that took a lot of people from poverty and put them as low income and even middle class groups in Latin America. But that means from the a significant change in the consumption patterns in the regions. And that's, I would like to go specifically in one of the topics you were addressing, that it's transport.
That being said,
When we see this change of, I mean, these new groups or new consumers addressing what are they buying and what are they doing, it's very important to see what's happening in the region. Because the first thing you notice, it's well, it's known the Engel law.
So
it's basically as the income groups that are richer, they spend less in food and basically in foods. So the way it has fulfilled these new spaces of consumption is very important in the region. But on the contrary, as we spend less in food in the region, I mean, for each group, it has increased the expenditure in fossil fuels, cars, and other factors. You see as well a transition between people are spending more, the richer they are in education and also in health. So you see an economic transition in Latin America, people moving from public transport to private transport, moving from public education to private education, and as well to public health to private health. This transition is getting rather complex in the region. First of all, because with this transition, you are beginning to see other collateral damage or significant collateral damage apart from greenhouse emissions. Nowadays, you travel basically every big city in Latin America, and you have a big traffic.
We will have just a couple of more questions, and
as well traffic accidents, other different type of vehicles using there, that is getting a lot of negative externalities. So in Latin America, the first point we need to see is how to address this transition from public to private transport. Basically, it does. You can argue that this transition can be explained because in Latin America, the public transport facilities are very bad. And when I'm talking about public, it's not that it's owned by the state. No, it's by public transport.
Thank you for the
it's basically in the regions, the public transport facilities are very low, very bad, and we need to have a huge modernization of that process. You can see as well that, and that's going to, with the public policy part, when you try to see different studies of the demand of gasoline in the region. What we have found in these studies is, of course, that the demand for gasoline depends on a lot of factors. Among two main factors are income and the price of gasoline. And when you see these two factors, how they impact the consumption of gasoline, you see a significant difference with the developed countries. First of all, our income elasticity is larger than any developed country. And on the contrary, our price elasticity is very low. I'm just going to talk about the price elasticity, what I think it's significant, or it's rather important. First of all, that means that any price change in the price of gasoline, it does have an effect on consumption, but it's not very important impact. And it basically shows as well this very low price elasticity that Latin American rich people, when you increase the price of gasoline, they don't change mode of transport. They still stay in the private cars. So when we address that only using the price of gasoline, it's a problem because we might not find a change on pattern on the people. And second, it shows that basically we need to have a big push as well in huge new public transport infrastructure. In Latin America, if we don't do that, basically the price signals might be not enough, and the transition that we are facing now is not on the correct direction, to my point of view, but it's coming more on a very difficult transition. But it's good in the sense that people are getting richer and they are acquiring new goods, but on the other side, they are getting a lot of negative externalities. And if we don't address properly this topic, we might have a problem in the future. And to address this point, I would say as well that in the region, we have had still significant, in some countries, significant subsidies to oil, to gasoline. That is as well changing the pattern of the people in the region. It's making very cheap gasoline, and then we are moving that in that direction. So what I would like to address finally is that we need to see from the Latin American point of view, consumption pattern that we have now is not necessarily consistent with a low path carbon development. We need to change to address these new patterns of consumption in the region. And the way to address these new patterns of consumption in the region need to be, of course, using different price signals, but to address as well the significance that this price, at least now in Latin America, is very low because we don't have adequate substitutes. So besides the price signals, we need to try to build an important or significant new public infrastructure for transport. Otherwise, this transition to a low economy might be very difficult. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. So I think I'll come back to some other questions, but I do want to ask an offer to the audience. So I have a question. I'll probably take about 2 questions. So lady there and a gentleman there, and we can just the microphone if you can say who you are and where you're from.
I'm Emily Dahl. I'm with MIT. And I was wondering, this is a question for any of the panelists who care to answer, what are the areas that still have the greatest need for research to determine the most effective path forward in your areas of focus, and what kinds of research would that be?
Thank you. And just to the back there, I'll take the list. Grab these 2 gentlemen. Yeah, the gentleman just behind you, and then you, sir, and we'll take those 3 questions. So.
Thank you very much. This is a question to Tanya. Thank you very much for your comments. My name is Matt Hope. I'm a journalist with DSMOG UK. Given the climate fund that Shell signed up to is worth about £8 million a year for your multi-billion-dollar organisation, and Shell continues to explore for ever harder to reach hydro, how do you justify those activities that Shell does also continue to take climate change seriously?
Thank you. And the gentleman just in front.
From the transport sector by
Thank you very much. I'm coming from Ghana.
A very significant portion, considering that everything else would
my question will go to the lady from Shell
and so it's a very important part of the solution here. And on co-benefits, absolutely.
I'm just worried about
VKT. Not only
the figure
do we help
that was quoted by Kamali,
VKT
that the world will require about $2 trillion
so by reducing VKT
per year
by half versus
in order for us to stay below 2 degrees. Is that right?
Million lives per year.
Sorry, that was the that's the annual requirement for fossil fuels, just to so the remaining fossil fuels, even staying within a carbon budget of 2 degrees. So that the companies that are involved in that sector have financing requirements as well. That was my point.
I am a little bit worried because, yeah, coming from Africa, Ghana specifically, where our NDC is very robust and trying to move away from the use of fossil fuel and moving into renewable energy. If it will take such an amount of money,
regarding the co-benefits, I think
even in the presence of the fossil fuel usage, then it becomes a little bit difficult or more difficult for developing countries like Ghana to move away from the use of fossil fuel, thereby defeating the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The next question will be, how feasible will it be
African countries, for example?
For
and the second one is that
Shell
people have much more to deal with
to,
in terms
as
of
it were, completely move away from the fossil fuel industry by 2030.
Thank you. So, Tanya, you've got some good questions, but I think what I'd like to do for the team, and actually one of the things I thought with Luis Miguel and Marius is the sort of the lessons that can be learned as well, which might also play into the R&D and RD&D topic, because we've seen mission innovation last year and where that money, whether it's top down or whether to the point from Ghana, whether we're seeing enough bottom up actually trying to address some of those things. So if I can ask maybe Miguel to start with that, the R&D question and the how can we do it, and then we'll skip Tanya and then come back to Tanya to address the other questions as well.
Well, I think there is a lot of that need to be done in the area. No, I will just concentrate in some point, probably because of my actual now perspective, and it's the public policy debate. I think we need to have as well, under certain uncertainty, good sound research, but as well how to transform this good research in public policy specifically is very hard. It's not only the technical parts which I'm worried, but as well I would say the political economy. And for example, I'm going into the transport part. No? You have in Latin America, for example, when you see the expenditure reports of most countries, it's clearly a pattern like this, that the rich people spend more in gasoline than the poor people, no? Or basically, so any tax what you put there is not regressive so far, not least in the first round. But when you go to the countries, you have specifically, you receive more or less the opposite agenda. No? They say, no, it's a regressive thing, and you get people unsettled on that. No? Probably it's a big discussion if people expect at some point to have a car and then they think you are taking away something from them. No? So it's very difficult to have the technical aspects as well with the political economy of what will be the right choice and what are the proper coalition to make the changes. I think studies that I can link technical parts, political parts, and sociological impacts, it will be very, very useful to have.
Okay. Thank you. I'm conscious that Gilles has to go, so I think on the R&D question is, for a company that are at the forefront of it, let me hand on to
Yes, I think it's a key question, and I think Schneider Electric too, we make some mistakes. I have two levels. The first, when we are speaking about innovation, we are very often speaking about technical innovation, and that is key. But I'm sure, especially when we face the question of access to electricity, but when we face the question of a smart building too, we need to provide a lot of innovation that is not technical innovation in terms of manner of life. How do we finance? A lot of different things that we consider when we have in the technical vision that is okay. When we have technical solution, good solution at the worldwide level, we can deploy this solution, and certainly because that is smart, it's easy to deploy. And I'm sure the first thing we have to reinforce innovation in cultural vision, how do we find new business models, and it's not only after. It's a question of solar. It's a question of circular. Because if we are able to do both and together, certainly we will change the technical innovation. And I think we learned that with the reality in this time of transition. And the second thing about innovation, and it's more or less the same vision that I have in 1 minute, it's a question of offer and demand. At this stage, we spend a lot of time and a lot of money about innovation in the offer. And we consider that certainly with all manner to think, we have to innovate in the offer field about renewable energy, about storage, about a lot of things. And after that, that could be the question of the demand. And in the second time, we need to be in the circular situation and to spend a lot of time to have a smarter manner to consume and to put the demand on the top. Certainly, we will have a totally different vision about offer. So I have to go in green zone about a very precise solution about access to electricity in Africa.
Thanks, Gilles. Well, Marcus, shall we pick up on the sort of technology side and the innovation and maybe the lessons learned, and then recognizing the time, we're fairly quick on, and maybe the finance guys and how that innovation needs to be thinking, where they need to invest.
Yeah, I just want to highlight one specific topic of innovation that I believe is should be at the forefront of talking about energy efficiency and this type of world. And that is from our experience. I mean, we're investing about 3 billion euros each year, and we have 50,000 R&D guys involved also with the MIT. And I personally, by the way, am a physicist, so I did my doctorate on disordered systems with low dimensions. And what I noticed over the past 20 years, the theoretical models on big data have not changed. There's been, in my personal point of view, there's the processing speed which has improved, so the computer speed has improved. But what we need to move to a smart world, whether it's smart agriculture, smart mobility, smart cities, smart whatever, we improve the sensors that everyone is great in. But the learning theory, the fundamental models on how to actually make sense of the data, we are still very much at the beginning. We at Bosch, we are also very heavily investing in that in our own R&D. We're also working with universities. I'm not sure whether we're working on that topic with MIT, but if I would advise on one thing where one should really focus on is on what is today called big data, or I would rather say 20 years ago you called it learning theory.
No, I think that's a very good point, because I think when we were doing our modeling, we were coming up against some significant barriers. So Michael and Babe, really quick, and then we'll get into Tanya. Yeah. Right.
So the gentleman from Ghana, I mean, so 3 points. First of all, don't worry in terms of the quantum of capital. The quantum is actually not the issue. So, you know, the global capital markets are around $240 trillion. So, you know, the sources of capital are immense. For Ghana specifically, on your question, it's really a matter of how can you make the opportunity investable. And I mean, just in brief on that, the key issue is lowering the cost of capital to attract private capital to come in behind. And you know, that's so the development finance institutions will have a role. The Green Climate Fund would have a role to provide de-risking capital, which could then crowd in private capital behind. I think that's the main point.
I'll say a few words about areas of research which I think are necessary, especially in relation to the transformation issue. I think scenario analysis, which I think is going to be the major focus of the recommendations from the task force, the practical application of scenarios by companies and financial institutions, especially looking at disaggregation and asset level data disclosure is going to be very, very important. I know there's some important work going on in Oxford University on that, and I think there's more that's required. The energy transformation itself and stranded assets, there's a lot of research going on in that area, but I think more is required in terms of how the different energy components and the mix between fossil fuels, between disruptive technologies, how they all interface with each other and how they interact, I think is another area of major research which is should be required. Not that there isn't some already happening, but more. And then finally, just to touch upon what Abid said about capital flows and incentivizing capital flows. We've heard about the green bond market and how that's acting as a major incentive to try and bring the capital markets into financing the transition. I mean, we at S&P Global are doing a lot of work in that as well through our green bond evaluation, but more research is required in terms of what actually investors want in terms of pricing incentives to try and decarbonize the world's economy. Because at the moment, that's a little bit uncertain and there's not enough research in that area.
Okay, and Tanya, finally.
Yeah, I'll comment on a few of the points. I thought I'd start with your question about R&D, because I think it probably, I always think of it as being staged. I think in that kind of pure research thing, we should try everything. We don't know what